At just 13 years old, Maria was cast out of her home, shamed and abandoned by the very people who were meant to love her most. Alone and pregnant, she wandered the streets, facing rejection and cruelty at every turn. But when a kind-hearted baker took her in, Maria's journey from despair to triumph began. Watch how one act of kindness transformed her life and led to an unexpected reunion that would test the power of forgiveness. The small house in the outskirts of San Pedro was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. Maria Alvarez, barely 13, sat trembling at the dining table. Her father, Hector, loomed over her, his face a mask of fury. Her mother, Estela, stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, her expression cold and distant. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Maria?" Hector's voice thundered, shaking the air in the cramped room. Maria's lips quivered as she struggled to form words. Her heart pounded in her chest and her hands clenched the hem of her shirt. I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Didn't mean to?" Hector slammed his fist on the table, making Maria jump. "You've brought shame upon this family, Maria. How do you expect us to face the neighbors? The church? Do you know what they'll say?" Estela turned her back to the room, gazing out at the darkening street. Her voice, sharp and icy, cut through the tension. "You've ruined everything, Maria. How could you be so reckless? At your age? Pregnant?" She spat the word as though it were poison. "I'm sorry," Maria cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared." "Enough!" Hector's voice roared again, his eyes burning with anger. "There is no excuse for this. You've disgraced us. You've ruined our name. Do you think sorry will fix this?" Maria's sobs filled the room, but Estela remained unmoved. "There's no place for her here anymore, Hector," she said coldly. "We can't let her drag this family down. She needs to go." "No, please, Mama," Maria begged, falling to her knees. "Don't send me away. I have nowhere to go. I don't know what to do." But Estela didn't look at her. "Get out, Maria," she said quietly, the finality in her tone slicing through Maria's heart. "You've made your bed. Now you must lie in it." Hector stepped toward the door and pointed outside. "You heard her. Leave, and don't come back." Maria stared at her parents, her vision blurred by tears. Her legs trembled as she stood, clutching her small bag of belongings. "Please, Papa. Mama." Her voice cracked with desperation. But Hector had already turned his back, and Estela didn't move from the window. The neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the shouting. Their curious eyes burned into Maria as she stumbled out of the house. Murmurs and whispers buzzed like angry bees around her. "Shameless," one woman muttered. "Disgraceful," another added. Maria wiped her tears with the sleeve of her worn sweater and ran, her feet pounding against the pavement. Rain began to fall, cold and relentless, soaking her through as she disappeared into the night. With every step, the sound of her father's angry voice and her mother's cold disdain echoed in her mind. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew one thing. She was alone. Rain poured from the heavens, relentless and unyielding as Maria Alvarez stumbled through the streets of San Pedro. Her clothes clung to her small frame, soaked through and heavy, and her feet were muddy and cold. She hugged herself for warmth, but the biting wind cut through her thin sweater, chilling her to the bone. With every step, Maria's desperation grew. She turned down one dimly lit alley after another, hoping for some small reprieve from the rain, but all she found were shuttered doors and unwelcoming walls. The weight of her father's voice and her mother's rejection bore down on her, louder than the storm around her. Her stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the cold only amplified her exhaustion. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of an open doorway and hurried toward it, her heart pounding with hope. When she reached the threshold, a middle-aged man stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. His face was etched with irritation as he looked her up and down. "What do you want, kid?" he barked. "Please, sir," Maria pleaded, her voice trembling. "I just need a place to stay for the night. I won't cause any trouble." The man's scowl deepened. "I don't run a shelter. Get lost. I don't want your kind hanging around." Before Maria could say another word, he slammed the door in her face, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Her shoulders shook as fresh tears mingled with the rain on her cheeks. She turned away, her legs barely carrying her as she trudged forward. Maria's feet led her to a small park on the edge of town. The playground equipment gleamed wetly in the faint light of a nearby lamppost. She collapsed onto a wooden bench, curling into herself to shield against the rain. Her hands instinctively cradled her belly as if to protect the fragile life growing inside her. "Why does everyone hate me?" she whispered to the night, her voice breaking. "What did I do to deserve this?" The wind howled in response, a cruel reminder of her isolation. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the misery, but her heart raced with fear. Every rustle of leaves or distant shout sent a jolt through her body. Then, from the shadows, a coarse voice broke through the storm. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Maria's head shot up, her eyes wide with terror. 3 men emerged from the darkness, their faces partially obscured but their intentions unmistakable. One of them grinned, his teeth glinting in the faint light. "A little girl all alone at this hour? That's not safe," he sneered, taking a step closer. Maria scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. "Please, leave me alone," she said, backing away. Another man chuckled. "We're just trying to help. Don't run now." Maria turned and bolted, her feet slipping on the wet ground. The sound of their laughter and pounding footsteps behind her filled her ears. Panic surged through her veins as she ran blindly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain blurred her vision, but she spotted a narrow alleyway and darted into it. The men's voices grew fainter as she pressed herself against a wall, her chest heaving. She held her breath, willing herself to become invisible. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the sound of footsteps faded entirely. Maria finally allowed herself to sink to the ground, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She hugged her knees to her chest, sobbing quietly. The night stretched on, cold and unrelenting. Rain continued to pour, soaking through Maria's clothes and chilling her to the core. She tried to stay awake, but her body gave in to exhaustion, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were haunted by the faces of her parents, their voices filled with anger and disdain. "You deserve this, Maria," her mother's voice echoed in her mind, jolting her awake. When she opened her eyes, the rain had let up, but her body ached from the cold. Her skin was pale, and her lips trembled uncontrollably. She felt lightheaded, and a wave of nausea swept over her. "Am I going to die here?" The thought crept into her mind, filling her with dread. Suddenly, through the haze of her feverish thoughts, she heard the soft rustling of footsteps nearby. A silhouette appeared, framed by the faint glow of a street lamp. Maria blinked, trying to focus. "Child, what are you doing here?" came a warm, elderly voice. Maria struggled to sit up, her strength failing her. She vaguely made out the figure of an older woman holding a large umbrella. The woman's face was etched with concern as she knelt beside Maria. I have nowhere to go," Maria whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. The woman gently touched Maria's forehead, frowning. "You're burning up. Don't be afraid, my dear. I'll help you." Before Maria could protest, the woman scooped her up with surprising strength for someone her age. "Let's get you out of this cold," she said softly. As Maria's head lolled against the woman's shoulder, she felt a faint sense of warmth and safety. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to hope. The soft chime of a bell echoed as Margaret Lopez pushed open the door to her small bakery. The cozy space, nestled in the heart of San Pedro, was warm and inviting, filled with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread and pastries. The elderly baker shuffled inside, carrying a rain-soaked bundle in her arms. A frail young girl she had found crumpled on a park bench in the dead of night. Margaret gently laid Maria Alvarez on a worn but clean cot in the corner of the bakery's back room. The girl's clothes were soaked, and her skin was alarmingly pale. Margaret quickly grabbed a blanket from a nearby shelf and draped it over Maria's trembling body. The girl murmured faintly, her fevered mind too far gone to comprehend where she was. "Poor child," Margaret whispered, brushing Maria's damp hair away from her face. "What on earth happened to you?" Margaret moved quickly, lighting a small heater to warm the room. She prepared a pot of tea and a bowl of broth, setting them on a tray beside the cot. She watched Maria's chest rise and fall in shallow breaths, her heart aching at the sight of someone so young and vulnerable in such a dire state. After what felt like hours, Maria stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. The world was a blur, but she felt warmth for the first time in what seemed like days. The soft glow of a lantern illuminated an unfamiliar but cozy room. Confused and weak, she tried to sit up, but her body protested. "Easy there, dear," Margaret said, her voice gentle. She stepped closer, holding the cup of tea. "You're safe now. Here, drink this." Maria blinked at the woman, her vision clearing. She saw a kind face framed by silver hair, eyes filled with concern and warmth. With great effort, she sat up, her hands shaking as she accepted the cup. "Thank you," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. The warmth of the tea spread through her, easing the cold that had seeped into her bones. Margaret smiled softly. "No need to thank me. What's your name, child?" "Maria," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "Maria Alvarez." Margaret nodded, sitting down beside her. "Maria, how did you end up out there in this storm? Where is your family?" At the mention of her family, Maria's face crumpled, and tears welled up in her eyes. She clutched the blanket tightly, unable to meet Margaret's gaze. They don't want me anymore," Maria choked out, her words punctuated by sobs. "They said I've disgraced them. My father, he threw me out." Margaret's heart ached as she listened. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, my dear. No one deserves to be treated like that." Maria wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice trembling. I didn't know where to go. I thought I might—" Margaret shook her head, her expression firm but kind. "You're not alone anymore, Maria. You'll stay here with me as long as you need." The girl's eyes widened in disbelief. "But I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Margaret said, her tone resolute. "This bakery has seen plenty of hard times, and I've managed just fine. You'll help me around here, and together we'll figure things out. How does that sound?" Maria nodded slowly, her tears falling freely now. Not from despair, but from the first glimmer of hope she'd felt in days. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret patted her hand gently. "You get some rest, child. There's plenty of time to talk in the morning." As Maria drifted off to sleep, Margaret stayed by her side, watching over her like a guardian angel. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the bakery there was a small haven of warmth and safety. The next morning, Maria awoke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of fresh bread baking. She sat up, her body still aching but her spirit lighter. Margaret bustled around the small kitchen, her movements quick and practiced as she kneaded dough. "Good morning," Margaret said warmly, noticing Maria stirring. "How are you feeling?" "A little better," Maria replied, her voice stronger than before. "Thank you for everything." Margaret waved a flour-covered hand dismissively. "Think nothing of it. Now come sit and have some breakfast. You'll need your strength." Maria hesitated but obeyed, sitting at the small wooden table. Margaret set down a plate with a warm roll and a slice of cheese, along with a glass of milk. Maria's stomach growled loudly and she flushed with embarrassment. "Eat up," Margaret said with a chuckle. "No one goes hungry in my bakery." As Maria took her first bite, tears threatened to spill again. The simple meal was more than just food. It was a symbol of kindness she hadn't expected to find in the cold, uncaring world she'd been cast into. Margaret watched her eat, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Maria, I don't know what life's thrown at you, but as long as you're here, we'll face it together. Understand?" Maria looked up, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "Call me Margaret," the baker said with a wink. "And if you're feeling up to it, I could use an extra pair of hands around here." A small smile crept onto Maria's face for the first time in days. "I'd like that." With Margaret's kindness and the warm embrace of the bakery, Maria felt a spark of hope ignite within her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a chance to begin again. The morning sun bathed Margaret's small bakery in a warm glow, the scent of fresh bread wafting out into the narrow streets of San Pedro. Inside, Maria Alvarez carefully wiped the wooden tables, her movements slow and deliberate. She still felt the weight of her past, but under Margaret's guidance, she was beginning to find a fragile sense of stability. "You're doing great, Maria," Margaret said, her voice full of encouragement as she kneaded dough behind the counter. "You've got a natural knack for tidying up. Customers love a clean space." Maria smiled faintly, her hand steadying as she finished wiping the last table. She glanced out the bakery window at the bustling street. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. However, outside the bakery, things were less welcoming. The gossip had started almost immediately after Maria arrived. Whispers followed her wherever she went, neighbors eyeing her suspiciously as they passed by. The words weren't always subtle. "Isn't that the girl who got thrown out of her house?" a middle-aged woman muttered to her friend as they strolled past the bakery. "I heard Margaret took her in. Can you believe it? Sheltering someone like that?" "What is she thinking?" the other replied, casting a disdainful glance through the bakery window. Maria shrank away from the sound, her heart sinking. She busied herself behind the counter, hoping to avoid the prying eyes of anyone who might come in. Margaret noticed her unease and gave her a reassuring smile. "Pay no attention to them, dear," she said, her voice kind but firm. "People will always find something to talk about. What matters is what you know in your heart." Despite Margaret's comforting words, the whispers only grew louder. Customers began to hesitate before entering the bakery, their eyes darting toward Maria before making an excuse to leave. One afternoon, as Margaret took inventory in the back room, Maria was sweeping near the front counter when a customer walked in. It was Mrs. Delgado, a prominent figure in the neighborhood, known for her sharp tongue and sharper opinions. She approached the counter with an air of superiority. "Margaret," she called out, her voice loud enough to carry into the back. "Are you here?" Maria stepped forward cautiously. "Margaret's in the back. Can I help you?" Mrs. Delgado's eyes narrowed, scanning Maria from head to toe. "Oh, it's you," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I've been hearing all about you." Maria froze, gripping the broom tightly in her hands. I'm just helping out." "Helping out?" Mrs. Delgado's laugh was cold. "You should think twice about being here. Margaret's reputation is already suffering because of you. Good people don't want to buy bread from a place that harbors troublemakers." Maria bit her lip, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Before she could respond, Margaret emerged from the back room, her face calm but resolute. "Mrs. Delgado," Margaret said, her voice steady, "if you're here to buy bread, I'll be happy to help you. But if you're here to spread gossip and hurtful words, you can leave." The older woman's jaw dropped, clearly not expecting Margaret's firm stance. "Margaret, you've always been such a respected member of this community. Why risk everything for her?" Margaret straightened her back, her eyes blazing with determination. "Because kindness doesn't depend on reputation, Mrs. Delgado. This bakery has always been about more than just bread. It's a place where everyone is welcome." Mrs. Delgado huffed, grabbing her purse. "Suit yourself, Margaret, but don't be surprised if your loyal customers stop coming." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Maria's hands trembled as she set the broom aside. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Margaret turned to her, her expression softening. "Trouble? You've brought nothing but hard work and heart into this bakery. Don't let people like her make you think otherwise." Maria nodded, though the weight of the encounter lingered. As the days turned into weeks, the bakery saw fewer customers. The once lively shop was quieter now, the tension from the neighborhood's gossip seeping into the atmosphere. Margaret refused to let it dampen her spirits, working harder than ever to draw in customers. She began experimenting with new recipes, creating enticing pastries that filled the air with their sweet aroma. One crisp afternoon, Maria stood by the window, wiping it down as Margaret kneaded dough behind the counter. The soft glow of the sun made the bakery appear warm and inviting from the outside, but few dared to step inside. Maria's gaze flickered toward the street, where Carlos and his group of friends loitered once again. They leaned against the wall across the road, laughing and exchanging sneering glances in her direction. Maria tried to ignore them, her heart pounding with unease. "They're here again," she murmured, glancing nervously at Margaret. Margaret looked up, her hands dusted with flour. Her face, though tired, held a quiet resolve. "Let them be, Maria. They're all bark and no bite." Maria nodded, though the tension in her chest didn't ease. She returned to her cleaning, trying to block out the muffled jeers and laughter coming from outside. Hours later, as the sun began to set and the last of the day's customers trickled out, Carlos and his friends made their move. The doorbell jingled as they stepped into the bakery, their loud, mocking laughter cutting through the stillness. "Evening, ladies," Carlos said, his grin wide and menacing as he sauntered up to the counter. His two companions followed, their eyes scanning the bakery with thinly veiled contempt. Margaret straightened her posture, wiping her hands on her apron. "What do you want, Carlos?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "Oh, we're just here to see how business is going," Carlos replied, leaning casually against the counter. "Doesn't look too good, though. Heard some people are avoiding this place because of—" He glanced at Maria, his grin widening. "Well, you know." Maria stiffened, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Please leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Carlos chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, we're just here to talk." He picked up a loaf of bread from the display, turning it over in his hands. "Nice bread. Shame if anything happened to it." "Put that down," Margaret said sharply, stepping forward. "This isn't a playground." Carlos raised his hands mockingly. All right, no need to get worked up." But as he set the bread down, he knocked over a stack of rolls with an exaggerated gesture. They tumbled to the floor, scattering everywhere. "Oops," he said with feigned innocence. "Guess my hand slipped." Margaret's eyes blazed with anger. But before she could respond, one of Carlos's friends grabbed a tray of pastries and tossed it onto the counter. Another began knocking over chairs, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "Stop it!" Maria cried, rushing forward to try and pick up the fallen items. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Why are you doing this?" Carlos stepped closer, his grin fading into a sneer. "Because people like you don't belong here. You think you can just waltz into our neighborhood and ruin things for everyone?" "Leave her alone!" Margaret shouted, grabbing a broom from behind the counter. She stepped between Carlos and Maria, her frail frame trembling with rage. "Get out of my bakery or I'll call the police." Carlos stared at her for a moment, then let out a cold laugh. "All right, old lady, we're leaving." He turned to his friends. "Let's go." They sauntered out, their laughter echoing in the street. The bakery door swung shut behind them, the small bell jingling hollowly in the tense silence. Maria knelt on the floor, her hands trembling as she picked up the scattered pastries. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the flour-dusted tiles. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "This is all my fault." Margaret crouched beside her, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maria, this isn't your fault. Those boys have no decency. Don't let their actions make you think any less of yourself." "But they're right," Maria said, her voice barely audible. "Since I came here, everything's gotten worse. Customers are avoiding us. Your business is suffering. You've done so much for me, and I'm just making things harder." Margaret shook her head firmly. "This bakery has faced hard times before, Maria. It's nothing new. What matters is that we don't give up. Do you hear me?" Maria nodded reluctantly, though the guilt in her eyes remained. That night, after cleaning up the mess and locking the doors, Margaret sat at the small kitchen table, going over the bakery's finances. The numbers were grim. Business had dropped significantly since the gossip began, and the incident with Carlos had only worsened her fears. Maria sat across from her, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She watched Margaret's furrowed brow and the way her hands trembled slightly as she wrote in her ledger. "I think I should leave," Maria said quietly, breaking the silence. Margaret looked up sharply. "Don't say that." "I mean it," Maria continued, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm bringing you nothing but trouble. If I go, maybe things will get better. People will stop talking. Customers will come back." Margaret reached across the table, taking Maria's hands in her own. "Listen to me, Maria. You are not the problem. People's ignorance and cruelty are the problem. I took you in because I believe in you, and I won't let a few bullies scare me into abandoning you." Maria looked down, her tears falling onto the table. "I don't want to lose you, Margaret. You're the only family I have." Margaret's grip on her hands tightened. "And I'm not going anywhere. We'll face this together no matter how hard it gets. Do you understand?" Maria nodded, her heart heavy but filled with gratitude for the woman who refused to give up on her. As the night deepened and the bakery grew quiet, both women silently resolved to stand firm against the storm, no matter how fierce it became. Together, They would weather the challenges ahead. The bakery had been quieter than ever, and Maria could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on Margaret. The once vibrant bakery now seemed like a shadow of itself, and Maria couldn't help but blame herself. She had brought trouble to the only person who had ever shown her kindness, and she could no longer bear the guilt. One cold morning, Maria woke before dawn. The bakery was silent, and Margaret's soft snores could be heard from the small cot in the corner of the kitchen. Maria sat up in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart was heavy, torn between her deep gratitude to Margaret and the crushing guilt she carried. "I can't let her suffer because of me," Maria whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. That afternoon, Maria helped Margaret with the day's baking as usual. She kneaded the dough and shaped it into loaves, her hands moving mechanically while her mind raced. Margaret hummed softly to herself, the tune a faint echo of better days. The sight of Margaret's frail hands working tirelessly made Maria's heart ache. "I'm going to make sure you're okay, Ba," Maria thought, "even if it means leaving." Later, while Margaret rested after the day's work, Maria quietly packed her few belongings into a small bag, a change of clothes, a photo of the bakery she had taken one morning, and a scarf Margaret had given her for warmth. She sat at the small kitchen table and wrote a note on a scrap of paper, her tears smudging the ink as she wrote. "Dear Mrs. Margaret, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. You saved me when I had no one, and I'll never forget your kindness. But I can't let you suffer because of me anymore. I've caused too much trouble, and the bakery doesn't deserve this. Please don't worry about me. I'll find a way to make it on my own. You're my family, and I love you. Maria." Early the next morning, Maria placed the note on the table, kissed Margaret's forehead while she slept, and slipped out of the bakery. The streets were quiet, the world still cloaked in the pre-dawn shadows. Maria pulled her worn coat tightly around her, bracing against the chill in the air. Maria walked for hours, her steps heavy as she wandered through the unfamiliar streets on the outskirts of the city. Eventually, she came across a weathered boarding house. Its paint was peeling, and the windows were fogged, but it offered shelter. Maria hesitated before stepping inside. The landlady, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, eyed her skeptically. "Room number 3. Don't bother me if you can't pay up," she said curtly, tossing Maria a key. The room was small and dark, with a single bed and a creaky wooden chair. Maria placed her bag on the floor and sat on the bed, staring at the cracked walls. Her chest ached with loneliness, and tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. "We'll get through this, Anna," Maria whispered, her hand resting on her growing belly. "We don't have a choice." Over the next few days, Maria searched tirelessly for work. She approached shopkeepers, cafes, and even street vendors, but rejection met her at every turn. Some claimed they had no vacancies, while others simply turned her away with judgmental glances at her belly. "You're too young," one shopkeeper said dismissively, his eyes hard. "We don't want any trouble." Maria bit her lip, swallowing the sting of rejection, and bowed her head in thanks before leaving. Each step away felt heavier than the last. The boarding house offered no respite. The other tenants whispered about her, their words cutting into Maria like knives. "She's probably running from something," one woman said loudly enough for Maria to hear. "Her family must have kicked her out for a reason," another added, their tone dripping with disdain. Maria stayed silent, keeping to herself as much as possible. But one afternoon, as she returned to her room, she found the door slightly ajar. Her heart sank. Inside, the room was ransacked. Her few belongings were scattered across the floor, and her small pouch of money was gone. Maria dropped to her knees, frantically searching through the mess, but the money was nowhere to be found. No, this can't be happening," Maria whispered, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She ran to the landlady, her desperation palpable. "Please, someone stole my money. It wasn't much, but I need it." The landlady's expression hardened. "Don't blame others for your own carelessness. You have 24 hours to pay, or you're out." "But I didn't do anything wrong," Maria cried, her voice trembling. The landlady shrugged and walked away, leaving Maria standing in the hallway, helpless and broken. That night, Maria sat in her dark room, clutching her belly as silent tears streamed down her face. The cold seeped into her bones, and the weight of her isolation pressed down on her. "I'm sorry, Anna," she whispered. "I tried, but I don't know how much more I can take." The next morning, Maria gathered her belongings once more. The landlady didn't even look at her as she handed over the keys. Maria stepped out into the cold streets, her future uncertain. As she wandered aimlessly, Maria's mind drifted back to the warmth of the bakery and Margaret's unwavering kindness. Her heart ached with longing, but she knew she couldn't return. She couldn't bring more trouble to the only person who had ever cared for her. Maria walked into the unknown, carrying her few belongings and the hope that she could find a place where she and Anna would finally belong. But deep down, she felt the cracks in her resolve, threatening to shatter her completely. The streets were quieter than usual, the city cloaked in an oppressive stillness as Margaret Lopez trudged forward, gripping a flashlight in her trembling hand. Her heart was heavy with worry, and her steps were unsteady, but she refused to stop searching. Days had passed since Maria left the bakery, and the note Maria had left only deepened Margaret's resolve to find her. Maria, meanwhile, sat huddled in an abandoned corner of the city, the cold seeping into her bones. Her thin coat offered little protection against the biting wind, and her stomach growled with hunger. She clutched her belly, murmuring to her unborn child, "I'm sorry, Anna. I don't know how to give you the life you deserve." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked up at the dimly lit sky. It felt as though the world had turned its back on her, leaving her to fend for herself with nothing but the tiny life growing inside her for company. Margaret's search led her through alleyways and parks, each corner holding the possibility of finding Maria or the fear of coming up empty. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of worry and guilt. "Why didn't I notice how much she was struggling?" she muttered under her breath. "Why did I let her feel like a burden?" At last, her flashlight beam caught sight of a familiar figure, curled up against a crumbling brick wall. Margaret's breath caught as she quickened her pace. "Maria!" she called out, her voice trembling with both relief and urgency. Maria's head shot up at the sound of her name. She squinted through her tears, her vision blurred, and then she saw her, Margaret. Her frail figure illuminated by the flashlight's glow, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. "But Margaret?" Maria's voice cracked barely above a whisper. Margaret dropped the flashlight and rushed to Maria's side, falling to her knees despite the hard pavement. She wrapped her arms around the shivering girl, her warmth breaking through the chill that had settled in Maria's heart. "You foolish child," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You scared me half to death. Why did you leave like that?" I didn't want to be a burden," Maria stammered, her tears flowing freely now. "I didn't want to bring you more trouble. I thought leaving would make things easier for you." Margaret gently pulled back, placing her hands on Maria's shoulders. Her stern but kind eyes met Maria's tear-streaked face. "You think losing you would make things easier for me? You're my family, Maria. Family doesn't abandon each other." The words broke something inside Maria, releasing all the fear and loneliness she had been holding in. She collapsed into Margaret's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Margaret held her tightly, her own tears falling silently. "We'll figure it out together," Margaret said softly, stroking Maria's hair. "We've faced worse, haven't we? This is nothing we can't overcome." The two sat there in the cold night, their bond stronger than ever. Maria clung to Margaret, her trembling easing under the older woman's soothing words. For the first time in days, Maria felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. Margaret had found her, and she believed in her. When they finally returned to the bakery, Margaret wasted no time. She brewed a cup of hot tea and handed it to Maria, who sipped it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. "Maria," Margaret began, her voice gentle but firm, "don't ever think you have to go through this alone. You're not just a tenant here. This is your home, and I'm not letting you go again." Maria nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ba. I'm so sorry for leaving." Margaret reached out, placing a wrinkled but steady hand on Maria's cheek. "No more apologies. Just promise me you'll trust me to stand by you no matter what." "I promise," Maria said, her voice trembling but resolute. That night, as Maria lay in the familiar comfort of her small bed at the bakery, she placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "We're home, Anna. We're safe." Margaret, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, looked out into the darkened street. Her heart ached with the trials they had faced, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would heal. In the quiet of the night, hope began to take root once more. The bakery's warm, inviting aroma of fresh bread filled the air once more, a testament to Margaret and Maria's determination to move forward. The early morning sun cast a golden glow through the windows, illuminating their modest kitchen. Maria worked quietly beside Margaret, kneading dough with steady hands. Though the sting of the neighborhood's gossip still lingered, she focused on the rhythmic motion of her work, letting it ground her. Over the next few weeks, Maria threw herself into helping Margaret rebuild the bakery's reputation. The judgmental stares from some neighbors hadn't faded, but they were now interspersed with warmer smiles from loyal customers. Maria began to notice small acts of kindness, a woman leaving a little extra change on the counter, or a man complimenting the fresh pastries. These gestures, though subtle, bolstered her spirit. One day, Margaret handed Maria a bundle of fresh loaves wrapped in brown paper. "Take these to Mr. Ramirez down the street," she said. "He's been a good friend to the bakery, and he could use a little help after his surgery." Maria hesitated. "What if people say something? I don't want to cause more trouble." Margaret placed a reassuring hand on Maria's arm. "Kindness has a way of silencing negativity. Just go with a smile." Maria walked to Mr. Ramirez's small home, her heart pounding. She handed him the bread, and to her surprise he gave her a warm smile. "Thank you, Maria. You've always been a good girl despite what some people say. Don't let them get to you." His words stayed with her as she returned to the bakery. They ignited a newfound determination in her to prove that she was more than the cruel labels the community had given her. As the bakery slowly regained its footing, Maria found herself dreaming of a brighter future. She sat with Margaret one evening, the two of them sipping tea after a long day's work. "I want to give my child something better, Margaret," Maria said softly, placing a hand on her growing belly. "A life filled with love and opportunity." Margaret smiled warmly. "You're already doing that, Maria. You're creating a world where Anna will know she's loved and where she'll grow strong, just like her mother." Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but this time they were tears of hope. The challenges didn't disappear overnight. Carlos and his troublemakers still lingered around the neighborhood, casting dark looks in Maria's direction. One afternoon they approached the bakery, but Maria stood her ground. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of her pain and resilience. "You don't scare me anymore. I have people who believe in me, and I'll keep working to prove them right." Carlos sneered but walked away. Margaret watched from the doorway, pride evident in her eyes. "That's my girl," she said, embracing Maria once the group had left. In the quiet moments after closing, Maria would sit by the counter, jotting down ideas in a worn notebook Margaret had given her. "What are you working on?" Margaret asked one evening, peering over Maria's shoulder. "I'm thinking about expanding the bakery someday," Maria said, her eyes lighting up. "Maybe adding a little cafe where people can sit and enjoy what we make. I want to name it after Anna." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Maria." Maria's resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She focused on mastering the art of baking, learning every recipe Margaret knew. She experimented with new flavors and techniques, and customers began to take notice. Slowly but surely, the bakery's reputation flourished. Maria, who had once been the subject of scorn, now earned quiet admiration from those who had doubted her. One evening after they closed the bakery, Margaret pulled Maria aside and handed her a small wrapped package. "This is for you," she said. Maria opened it to find a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant in the shape of a heart. "But Margaret, I can't take this." "You can and you will," Margaret said firmly. "It's a reminder that no matter what happens, you're loved and you're strong." Maria hugged her tightly, her gratitude too overwhelming for words. As Maria placed her hand on her growing belly that night, she whispered softly, "Anna, this is just the beginning for us. We're going to build a beautiful life, one filled with love and dreams." And in the comforting warmth of the bakery, surrounded by the aroma of fresh bread and the love of the woman who had saved her, Maria felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Together with Margaret, she was building not just a future, but a legacy. 13 years had passed since Maria had been cast out of her family home. The small cafe she now owned, named Anna's Corner, stood as a testament to her resilience and determination. The warm, inviting space was filled with the hum of conversation, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the gentle sound of Anna's laughter as she helped customers. Anna, now a bright and confident 13-year-old, was the embodiment of Maria's strength and hope. She greeted every customer with a smile, her energy lighting up the room. Her bond with Margaret was especially strong. Margaret, now in her late 70s, still helped out in the cafe, her presence a comforting constant in their lives. One crisp morning, as Maria cleaned the cafe counter, the chime of the doorbell caught her attention. She looked up, ready to greet the customer, but her smile froze. Standing in the doorway was a frail, silver-haired woman with lines of weariness etched deeply into her face. It was Estella, Maria's mother. The bustling cafe seemed to grow quiet, the noise fading into the background. Estella stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clutching the strap of her worn purse. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on Maria. For a moment, mother and daughter locked eyes, the weight of years of silence hanging between them. Maria's voice was cold but steady as she finally spoke. "What are you doing here?" Estella's lips trembled and her voice came out shaky. "Maria, I needed to see you." "You needed to see me?" Maria's tone carried a sharp edge. 13 years, and now you decide you need to see me? "I know I don't deserve to be here," Estella admitted, lowering her gaze. "But I couldn't live with myself anymore. I came to ask for your forgiveness." The raw vulnerability in Estella's voice unsettled Maria, but the anger and pain she had carried for over a decade surged forward. "Forgiveness? After what you did to me? After you let him throw me out like trash?" Anna, who had been restocking pastries nearby, looked up in confusion. "Mom? Who is this?" Maria took a deep breath, her voice softening as she turned to her daughter. "Anna, this is your grandmother." Anna's wide eyes flicked between her mother and Estella. "Grandmother?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Estella knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached out toward Anna. "Yes, my dear. I'm your mother's mother, and I made terrible mistakes, but I'd like the chance to know you, if you'll let me." Anna hesitated, looking to Maria for guidance. Maria's heart twisted at the sight of her daughter caught in the middle of her past and present. "Why now, Estella?" Maria asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why are you here after all this time?" Estella stood, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your father. He passed away last year," she said softly. "Before he died, he told me he regretted everything. He couldn't bring himself to face you, and now it's too late. I've carried that guilt ever since. But it's not just about him. I've missed you, Maria. I've missed so much, and I want to try to make things right." Maria turned away, her emotions a storm inside her. Margaret, who had been quietly observing from the corner, approached and placed a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. "Sometimes," Margaret said softly, "forgiveness isn't about them. It's about freeing yourself." Maria closed her eyes, trying to steady her thoughts. "It's not that simple, Margaret. She let him throw me out. She turned her back on me when I needed her most." Margaret nodded, her voice steady. "I know, and she has to live with that. But you've built something beautiful here, Maria. Don't let anger keep you from moving forward." Estella's voice trembled as she spoke again. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Maria. I just want the chance to prove that I'm sorry, to be here for you and Anna, in any way I can." Maria turned back to face her mother. She saw the weariness in Estella's eyes, the lines of regret carved deeply into her face. She thought of Anna, who had never known the love of a grandparent, and of Margaret, who had taught her that love and kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Maria said finally, her voice heavy with emotion. "But for Anna's sake, I'm willing to try." Estella broke into quiet sobs, her relief evident. "Thank you, Maria. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Anna stepped forward hesitantly, looking up at her mother for permission before giving Estella a tentative hug. If you're my grandmother, Anna said softly, maybe you can tell me about my mom when she was little. Maria's heart softened at the sight of her daughter bridging the gap. We'll see, she said quietly, a glimmer of hope flickering within her. As Margaret watched the 3 generations of women begin to mend their fractured bond, she smiled. Sometimes, she thought to herself, even the deepest wounds can heal with enough love and patience. Months after Estella's return, Maria agreed to host a small event at the cafe, a community appreciation day to thank the loyal patrons who had supported her journey. The event was simple yet heartfelt, with warm pastries, music, and stories shared over cups of coffee. It was also an opportunity for Maria to share her story of struggle, hope, and forgiveness. Margaret stood at the counter, her kind eyes glowing with pride as she watched the cafe fill with laughter and conversation. Anna flitted between tables, serving pastries and chatting with customers. Estella sat quietly in the corner, watching her daughter and granddaughter with a bittersweet smile. Though she still carried the weight of her mistakes, she was grateful for this second chance. Toward the end of the evening, Maria stepped forward, standing near the counter where a small microphone had been set up. The room quieted as she tapped the mic, her nervous smile softened by the supportive gazes around her. Thank you all for being here tonight, Maria began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. This cafe is more than just a business to me. It's a symbol of hope and perseverance. It wouldn't be standing here today without the kindness and support of so many. Her eyes turned toward Margaret, who stood near the register. First and foremost, I want to thank Margaret. You saved me when I was at my lowest. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. But more than that, you taught me what it means to love unconditionally. The crowd clapped warmly, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she gave Maria a small nod. Maria continued, her voice thick with emotion. I also want to thank my daughter, Anna. You are the light of my life, and every decision I've made has been for you. You've given me a reason to keep going, even when the world felt impossible to face. Anna, standing beside Estella, grinned and waved shyly as the audience clapped for her. Finally, Maria's gaze fell on Estella, her voice softened, and the room seemed to hold its breath. And to my mother, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful you're here. We've been through so much, and there's still a long way to go. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It allows us to build a future. Estella's eyes filled with tears, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. The room erupted in applause, but Estella's focus was entirely on her daughter. She knew these words were a gift she didn't deserve, but cherished deeply. As the applause died down, Margaret stepped forward, taking the mic. Maria, you've always been strong, even when you didn't realize it. And tonight, you've shown everyone here what it means to rise above hardship and embrace love. We're all so proud of you. The crowd clapped once more, and Maria felt a wave of warmth wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt truly whole. After the event, Maria, Anna, Margaret, and Estella sat together in the corner of the cafe, enjoying a quiet moment. Anna giggled as Margaret told a story from Maria's early days at the bakery, while Estella listened quietly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you for giving me a chance, Maria, Estella said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Maria looked at her mother, the pain and anger still lingering but no longer consuming her. It's not easy, but I'm trying. For Anna. For us. Estella nodded, her eyes brimming with hope. That's all I can ask for. As the night wound down, Maria stood by the cafe window, watching the lights twinkle in the distance. Margaret approached, placing a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. You've come a long way, my child, and there's so much ahead for you. Maria nodded, her heart filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Margaret. You're the reason I'm here. Margaret smiled. And you're the reason I have hope. Family isn't just about blood, it's about love, forgiveness, and the choices we make every day. Maria turned back toward the cafe where Anna was laughing with a customer, her youthful joy lighting up the room. Estella sat nearby, a soft smile on her face as she watched her granddaughter. For the first time, Maria allowed herself to believe that they could heal, that broken pieces could come together to create something beautiful. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey of love, resilience, and forgiveness. If this story inspired you, please please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that remind us of the power of humanity. Don't forget to share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. See you in the next video.